welcome to Homework 2 in the Python Crash Course. Once again, my name is Sam, and these courses were brought to you by Banana Chip Tech. Today we have 7 homework questions that we're going to work through that were based off our video on variables. Homework number 1 asked us to ask the user for a number and then multiply the user's number by 10. As you've noticed here in this example that I have, there's a lot of comments, but it's a good idea to put a lot of comments so that when other people are reading your code, or even when you're going back and looking over your code again, you understand what each line of code is doing and why you wrote it in the first place. And so I highly encourage you to get in the habit of just commenting your code so that you have that documentation available. To solve this problem, the first thing we're going to do is save the number that the problem tells us to multiply by. So if you remember the problem, it asked us, ask the user for a number, and then multiply the user's number by 10. So we're going to go ahead and save that 10 in an integer variable. If you remember from our variable tutorial, we just call it whatever we want the variable name to be called, and then store 10 in there. If the specifications change and we have to go back and change our code, we have one place that we can do this modification instead of having to do it in 20 or 30 different places. Let's go ahead and now ask the user for a number. We're going to, again, ask the user for the number using our input function. If you remember from our input and output tutorial that we talked about earlier, we can prompt the user to enter a number using the prompt in the input function, and then receive whatever the user types in, save it as a variable here. The next line of code, we're going to have to take that number that the user entered and convert it into an integer. If you remember from our previous discussions, input always stores the result of whatever the user types in as a string. When we're working with numbers, we need to make sure that we convert that string into an integer so that we can actually multiply it like a number. Next, we're just going to do, our simple multiplication. Notice that this little splat is our multiplication symbol instead of the x. If we had an x, we wouldn't know when we were typing in x or when we were typing in multiplies. So Python has decided, and pretty much all programming languages have kind of used the splat as the symbol of multiplication. And then after we've multiplied it and saved the result of that multiplication to another variable called multiply number, we're going to go ahead and print that multiply number back out to the user and to the screen. Okay, let's go ahead and run this code. Let's go ahead and jump into our next program. So in program 2, we need to ask the user for 2 numbers, divide the first number by the second number, and print out the result. So we go ahead and ask the user for the first number here in line number 8. Notice that we're using input and prompting the user for the first number. We do pretty much the same thing in line number 12 where we ask the user for the second number. Notice the only really difference here that we have is pretty much in our prompt. The code is pretty much the same. We're just going to be storing that result into a different variable. Once again, our input always results in a string, so we need to make sure that we convert those strings into integers so that we can actually do our division. After we do that conversion, we're going to go ahead and do the division, doing first number divided by second number. This symbol is our division symbol. We're going to do that division and then store this number into another variable. And then we're going to go ahead and print that results back out to the user. All right, let's go ahead and run this now. Let's see if it does what we actually needed to do. And so notice now it's asking me, please enter the first number. So I'm going to go ahead and enter, let's say, 6. Please enter the second number. Let's do 12. And I get 0.5. So that does make sense, right? So we have 6 as our first number, 12 as our second number. We get 0.5. Question number 3 asks us to ask the user for their name, their age, and their favorite food. Then to take that information and print it out as one message to the user. So first thing we're going to do is ask the user for their name using the input function and a prompt. Notice that we don't have to do any processing. We don't have to call the int function. We don't have to call the float function because we only really want this as a string. So therefore we can take that information in as a string and just store it as a string. That's fine. We're going to ask the user for the age, same thing. I mean, granted, age would be a number, and we could turn it into an integer, but since we're going to be printing it back out to the user anyway, we can just leave it as a string. We're going to ask the user for their favorite food using the same type of input statement. And then finally, we're going to print this information out to the screen. And so I'm going to introduce here kind of a new way of printing, and it's called string injection. And so what we could do here is we could put a %s whenever we want to insert a string into another string. So I have my first string here, which is, hi, you are blank years old and your favorite food is blank. And so what we can do is we can have our variables set up here in this what we call a tuple, and we can go ahead and put in name. So name would be injected first into the string, age would be injected second into the second position, and favorite food would be injected last, this last position. And so all three of these can be are variables that we can use to inject information into this one string. And notice that if we wanted to do this, we have to put a % at the end here to tell it that we have this string, we want to inject this information into it. Okay, let's go ahead and run this, make sure that we get what we want it to be. I hit run. What is your name? My name is Sam. What is your age? I'm going to say 40. What's your favorite food? I'm going to say pizza. And then you notice here it says, hi Sam, you are 40 years old and your favorite food is pizza. Question number 4 asked us to ask the user for their year of birth and then calculate how old they were based on today's year. So, I'm doing this in 2021, but if it's 2022, 2025, so on and so forth, you'd want to use that year, and then return this result out back to the user. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a global variable that tells us what the current year is. And it's a good idea to do this. That way, if you come back to do this program 3 years from now, all you got to do is change that one number and your entire program will still work the same way. And so I highly encourage you to get into that habit. The next thing we're going to do is ask the user for their birth year. We're going to do that. Use our input function and ask them what year they were born in. And then we're going to convert their birth year into an integer, and that way we can, treat it as an integer and use it as a year. And then we're going to calculate their age based on the current year subtracted by their birth year. And finally, print that back out. All right, let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. So what year were you born in? I'm going to say 1990. And notice we get 31. Number 5 asked us to ask the user for 3 numbers, make a list out of these numbers, and then print the resulting list back out to the user. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to prompt the user for 3 numbers. So we can use our input function to ask them for the first number, the second number, and the third number. And then what we're going to do is after getting those numbers, because remember that they're in a string format, we're going to convert them to an integer using this int function for all 3 of them. Next, we're going to put all these numbers in a list. And so notice that we can separate each element in the list by a comma to tell it that it's part of the list and they're distinct elements. Notice that we can use our variables here when we're creating our list. This is going to do is tell it, take whatever number is stored in number 1 and use that as part of the list, and so on and so forth. This kind of differs from the way we did it previously, where we just typed in 1, 2, and 3 for the numbers we wanted to store in our list. And then finally, we're going to print it back out to the screen. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. My first number is 3, second number is 6, third number is 1. We get 361 in a list. Question number 6 asks us to access the first and last element in a list and print it out to the screen. It said to make sure to test our code on lists of various sizes. We got a hint here that you can use the len listname to return the number of elements in the list. So let's first go ahead and create the list. If you remember from our previous discussions, all we have to do is put in these square brackets and separate each element by a comma. And we just created another list here just so that we can see we're trying out lists of different sizes, just to see that this still works. So let's go ahead and access the first element. So the great thing about lists is we can use these square brackets and then put in a number that corresponds to the index of the list in order to access an element in the list. Now notice that we started from 0. So whenever in computer science, or in most computer science languages, we always start counting from 0 in lists. So again, if we were to look at this would be index 0, this would be index 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 9. So again, the 0, if we wanted to access the 0, we would look at index 0. If we wanted to access 9, we'd use index 1, and so on and so forth. And so then we can go ahead and find the last one using that len mylist. Now notice here that we have a -1 at the end. Take a minute, think about why do you think that's the case. Okay, so I hope you looked at this index subscript or this index comment I put here, and we can see that the largest element or the last element in the list is index number 9. But let's count how many elements are in the list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there are 10 elements in the list. And remember that len returns the number of elements in the list. So len is going to give us 10 elements. And then if we want to access the last element, we're going to have to subtract it by 1. Okay, now let's go ahead and run this. If I hit the run button, I get 1 and 90. So if we look at this one, we get 1, and the last one is 90. And then we get 0 and 1 for this one, which is what we should have gotten. All right, let's say we want to go ahead and we want to get to 6 here. So we want to go to index 4. We change this to put that 4 in the square brackets, and we'll get 6. So that shows you how that we can use those square brackets to get an element. Okay, let's take a look at question number 7. Question number 7 asks us to create a list with 10 elements. Ask the user for a number between 1 and 10 and another number. Insert your second number into your created list at the position of the first number. So let's, that might seem a little confusing, but we have an example here. So let's say we get 3 and 50. This is our starting list. So at index number 3, we're going to want to insert 50. Right? So let's walk through this. So again, we're going to create our list here, and we're going to print out the length of the list just to show you that it's 10 elements long. Now we're going to ask the user for 2 numbers. So please enter the first number, and we're going to convert it to a integer. Remember, we have to do that whenever we want to work with integers because input always treats it as a string, and so we want to convert it to an integer. And so then we ask the user for another number, do the same thing. And now, pretty easy, we can do this in one line. We just have to use the subscript operator and use index, that first index that the user gave us, and set num equal to that index. Now, the problem with this code is that if the user enters some bad input, which is totally possible, this code might crash around this line here, right? Because we'll get an index that's out of bounds, basically. And I'll do an example. So first, let's just enter in our stuff to make sure that it works. So 5, let's say we want to replace it with 3. So we replaced index 5 with 3. I'm going to go ahead and print the list out instead of my list, instead of the length, so that we know what the starting list is. Let's go ahead and run it again. And so let's say we want to place the first element, or the 0th index, with 100. And so notice that we're able to get that. Now let's see what happens if I put in an index that's out of bounds. So I put in 100, and I put in 6. So notice I get this list assignment index out of range. And so we'll talk about ways that we can get around this using conditionals in our next video. Be sure to look out for that. All right, thanks.